They say the smallest moments can shape the largest destinies, that a single word spoken in cruelty can ignite a fire so bright it outshines an empire. And in this story, the spark begins in a quiet garden where innocence and arrogance collided, leaving scars that would grow into something far greater than revenge, something that would define the meaning of strength itself. Picture it. A mansion wrapped in marble columns and trimmed hedges sculpted like trophies of pride. A place where the rich breathed entitlement like oxygen, where every corner seemed to whisper you don't belong unless you were born into its luxury. And there, in the middle of that perfectly manicured world, two little girls laughed, one in a wheelchair, the other twirling to an imaginary song. And for a fleeting second, their joy was pure, unfiltered, untouchable, until a voice cut through like thunder, sharp and merciless. "Get that girl out of here right now." The voice belonged to David Morrison, a man who thought money not only bought silence and obedience, but also the right to dictate who was worthy of dignity. And in that moment, he stripped a child of it without hesitation, pointing at 9-year-old Luna, the maid's daughter, as though she were an intruder in a kingdom unfit even to share laughter with his paralyzed daughter Sophie. What strikes me here is how quickly the human heart can reveal itself. David's outrage wasn't about Luna distracting Sophie or breaking a rule. It was about class, about hierarchy, about teaching a child that her place in the world was beneath the shadows of those born with gold spoons in their mouths. And the tragedy is that children feel those wounds more sharply than we ever admit, for Luna's wide eyes filled with tears, but not ignorance. She understood perfectly well what he meant. She absorbed every syllable as if they were brands on her soul, and though her mother Carmen tried desperately to apologize, to pull her away and protect her, the humiliation had already carved itself into memory, and memory, as we'll see, is not a cage, but sometimes the fiercest weapon life can forge. Now imagine Sophie, just 7 years old, bound to her wheelchair, stretching her arms to Luna and crying out that she wanted her friend, her laughter, her light, and being silenced by the same father who confused cruelty with control. And think of the irony. David had all the wealth in the world, yet he could not buy the kind of joy Luna brought to his daughter, a joy he crushed in the name of pride. The scene ended with Carmen dragging Luna to the back door, her head low but her spirit strangely unbroken, and Luna, still sobbing, looked back one last time, etching the injustice into her heart, not as defeat but as fuel, as if whispering to herself that one day she would not only return but stand taller than this man could ever imagine. And this is where our story pivots, because while most tales of humiliation fade into bitterness, Luna's did not. It hardened into ambition. It taught her the unfair rules of the world early, and rather than letting them cage her, she decided to rewrite them. Let me pause here to analyze what we've seen. David Morrison represents a type we all recognize, the person who mistakes privilege for superiority, who measures worth by wealth, and forgets that dignity is the one currency no bank can mint. And Carmen, his maid, embodies the millions of invisible laborers who hold the world together but are treated as disposable. While Luna symbolizes the resilience of children who see injustice and decide, consciously or not, to outgrow it and overturn it. And Sophie, sweet Sophie, stands as proof that innocence recognizes friendship without the poison of social prejudice, until parents teach them otherwise. But why does this scene matter beyond its melodrama? Why should we care about a spoiled millionaire yelling at a maid's child? Because this is how cycles of exploitation are born. Casual humiliation solidify into barriers, a black mark on. A mother's reference ruins her chances of work for decades. A child told she isn't good enough learns early that she must fight harder than anyone else just to stand in the same room. And every society is built on thousands of such small cruelties, rarely noticed, rarely challenged, until someone decides to turn them into a storm that cannot be ignored. That someone in this story is Luna, who will spend the next 20 years building herself into the very thing David Morrison fears most: not a victim, but a woman with power, knowledge, and the ability to choose whether to extend mercy or deliver justice. And here's the hook that will carry us forward. What happens when the man who once sneered at her, who destroyed her mother's livelihood, finds himself on his knees, desperate for the same girl's skill to save his only daughter's life? When fate spins the wheel and delivers the ultimate irony, the maid's child holding the scalpel that determines whether the millionaire's legacy survives or crumbles. This isn't just a tale of poetic justice. It's a meditation on power, class, and the dangerous illusion that those born with wealth will always remain untouchable, because life has a way of handing the wheel to those you least expect. And when that moment comes, the question is not who holds the power, but how they choose to use it. And Luna, as we'll see, had every reason to wield hers like a blade, but instead chose something far more profound, proving that revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about building something so magnificent that the people who once belittled you have no choice but to recognize they were wrong from the very beginning. 2 decades passed like a whisper carried by time. And yet for Luna, the sound of David Morrison's voice still echoed in her chest like thunder. Not because she remained wounded, but because she refused to forget, because forgetting would mean erasing the fire that had driven her every day since that garden humiliation. And now at 29 years old, she was no longer a maid's daughter standing in the shadows. She was Dr. Luna Rodriguez, one of the youngest and most respected pediatric neurosurgeons in the nation, a woman whose white coat carried more weight than Morrison's millions ever could. And when she walked down the sterile halls of Children's Hope Hospital, colleagues stepped aside not out of fear but out of respect earned the hard way. Her mother, Carmen, who had endured years of exploitation after being fired by David Morrison, never lived long enough to see this transformation. She died of cancer 5 years earlier. Her life cut short, not just by illness, but by a system that denied her adequate health care because of her lack of insurance. And if you think this is merely background tragedy, understand this. Carmen's death was the catalyst that sharpened Luna's purpose. It reminded her that David's cruelty wasn't just personal, it was systemic, that his refusal to pay fair wages, his decision to blacklist domestic workers, his casual destruction of livelihoods left scars not only on individuals, but entire generations. And in honoring her mother, Luna vowed to attack the very roots of exploitation by becoming so irreplaceable that the same elite who once dismissed her would one day beg for her help. Life, as it often does, scripted irony better than any novelist, because one morning while reviewing patient files, Luna froze at a name she hadn't spoken in years: Sophie Morrison, 27 years old, progressive partial paralysis, urgent experimental. Surgery required, father, David Morrison. Emergency contact, and in that instant the universe placed a silver platter before her, not of vengeance but of opportunity, the girl she once danced with. The girl who reached for her while her father dragged her away was now on the edge of losing her mobility forever. And Luna was the only surgeon in the country capable of performing the procedure that could save her. Pause for a moment and let that sink in, because this is the kind of narrative turn that isn't just poetic. It's mythological. The child humiliated grows into the hero. The oppressor grows desperate. The innocent friend caught between them becomes the hinge of fate. And destiny asks the question, will Luna treat this as a chance to inflict revenge or as a test of her compassion? So she picked up the phone, dialed the familiar number, and when David's aged voice answered, she introduced herself calmly, her tone professional yet edged with history. "Mr. Morrison, this is Dr. Luna Rodriguez. I need to discuss your daughter's case," and you can imagine the silence on the other end, the recognition crawling into his throat, the disbelief that the little girl he once exiled from his garden now stood as his daughter's only hope, and he muttered, You're that cleaning lady's daughter," to which Luna replied, "Yes, and now I am the only person who can save your daughter's life." What fascinates me here is the reversal of power. David had once believed power was permanent, cemented by wealth. But power is fluid. It moves with knowledge, with persistence, with time. And the truth is that arrogance ages poorly, while resilience matures into mastery. And David Morrison was about to learn that the walls he built around class and privilege had collapsed under the weight of Luna's determination. 3 days later, he strutted into the hospital, suit tailored, hair silvered with precision, still wearing the armor of a man used to buying solutions, dismissing staff, demanding directors, scoffing at the idea that someone like Luna could be the one in charge. But hospitals aren't boardrooms, and prestige isn't purchased with checks. It's earned through skill and sacrifice. And when he sneered at the receptionist for offering him a subordinate, what he didn't know was that Luna was already watching from her office, calmly dialing an old friend, a lawyer who owed her a favor, setting into motion an investigation into David's decades of exploitation that would soon dismantle the empire he thought indestructible. But here's where the narrative tightens. Sophie, lying in her hospital bed, wasn't a child anymore. She was a journalist, intelligent, empathetic, someone who hadn't inherited her father's arrogance, and when she researched Luna's name, she discovered the truth that her old friend from the garden, the one who once made her laugh, was now the surgeon everyone in the country admired. And when she confronted her father, the weight of his past cruelty began to unravel before her eyes, because Sophie remembered Luna fondly, remembered the laughter, the warmth, the kindness, and in that memory, David's entire narrative of superiority began to collapse. This moment is critical because it shows that legacies aren't just financial. They're emotional. They're remembered in how children recall the people their parents humiliated or cherished, and Sophie's memory of Luna clashed violently with David's shame, exposing his cruelty not as power but as weakness, because power that must humiliate others to survive is already fragile. When Luna finally walked into Sophie's hospital room, white coat crisp, stethoscope gleaming, her presence was no longer that of a maid's daughter, but of a professional at the peak of her authority. And David could barely look at her, for she embodied everything he had denied, every limitation he had tried to impose. And now she had the authority not just to heal, but to decide the terms of healing. And yet she did not wield her position like a sword. She remained calm, professional, even compassionate toward Sophie, proving that real strength is not reactive but steady, and in that steadiness lay David's greatest defeat, because he realized she didn't need to destroy him, she had already surpassed him, and every second he stood in her presence was a reminder of that fact. If you strip away the drama for a second, what we're really witnessing is a commentary on cycles of power and justice, how humiliation can be transformed into purpose, how privilege without humility corrodes, and how the ultimate revenge is not vengeance, but transcendence, becoming so exceptional that those who once dismissed you must confront the truth of their own smallness. And in Luna's calm voice, David Morrison finally faced that truth. When Luna placed the medical forms on Sophie's bedside table and calmly explained the urgency of her condition, she wasn't simply giving instructions, she was holding a mirror up to David Morrison's life, showing him that for once the timelines, the choices, the very breath of his legacy did not obey his schedule or his money. They obeyed her expertise. And though he tried to assert control by demanding a second opinion, the cruel irony was that the next specialist was weeks away and Sophie might not survive the wait, leaving David cornered by a reality no check could bend. And this, I think, is one of the most humbling truths about power. It collapses the moment it encounters something money cannot buy, whether that's time, trust, or talent. And David was being forced to swallow that bitter medicine for the first time. Sophie, however, wasn't fooled. She could see the way her father's arrogance cracked every time Luna spoke, the way guilt tugged at his silence. And as a journalist, she pieced together the truth faster than he wanted, searching articles, reading about Luna's improbable journey from poverty to Harvard, from the daughter of a cleaning lady to one of the nation's most brilliant neurosurgeons, and then whispering with a mix of awe and grief, "It's her, the girl from the garden," while David turned pale, reminded of every word he'd shouted that day 2 decades earlier, words that now condemned him more loudly than any judge could. Luna, ever the professional, did not press this recognition. But her very composure was an indictment. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to humiliate him as he had once humiliated her, because her life itself was the proof of his smallness, her accomplishments, the receipts of resilience. And here's where her brilliance shines. She didn't just want to heal Sophie. She wanted David to confront the system he had perpetuated, so she called in her favor from a lawyer friend, digging into Morrison Enterprises, unearthing decades of unpaid wages, blacklists against domestic workers, tax evasion, exploitation, layered like bricks in the mansion of his wealth. And she carried those documents into Sophie's room like surgical instruments of truth, slicing through David's facade with precision. Let's pause to analyze why this matters. Too often stories of revenge focus on the personal, the individual wound avenged, but Luna's confrontation wasn't only personal. It was systemic. She understood that David wasn't just a cruel man to her family. He represented a larger rot in society where the powerful trample the working poor and disguise it as business. And by exposing him, she wasn't only settling her own score, she was pulling back the curtain for Sophie, for the hospital staff, for anyone watching, and that is what transforms a private wound into a public reckoning. Imagine the scene. Luna opens the folder, reads aloud about 47 complaints filed with the Department of Labor, families devastated, children unable to finish school, health problems ignored, and Sophie gasps in horror as she realizes her father's empire wasn't built on brilliance but on exploitation. And David stammers that business is business, but his voice is weak, his eyes darting. because deep down he knows business is no excuse for cruelty. And here Luna delivers the quiet dagger, not shouting, not gloating, but stating plainly, "I did not spend 20 years becoming irreplaceable just to destroy you. I did it to prove that no matter how hard you tried to bury me, I would rise higher than you ever dreamed." And in that moment, David isn't just facing Luna. He's facing Carmen, the mother he ruined. He's facing every maid, every worker, every family whose name was stained by his greed. Sophie, caught between loyalty to her father and admiration for Luna, begins to understand that redemption does not come from denial but from action. And she resolves silently that if she survives this, she will not inherit her father's sins, but will honor the courage of the friend he tried to erase. And here's where the story deepens, because Luna could have let vengeance guide her. She could have refused the surgery and let David feel the full weight of despair. But that's not who she had become. She had trained to heal, not to destroy. And the real power of her choice lay in proving that compassion is the ultimate victory over cruelty. Because while David used his power to crush lives, Luna would use hers to save one, even if it was his daughter. And that contrast, the destroyer versus the healer, is the heart of this narrative. The reason it resonates beyond one family's tragedy into a lesson about what we do with the pain we inherit. The night before the surgery, the hospital corridors buzzed with routine sounds, rolling carts, distant beeps, murmurs of nurses. But inside Sophie Morrison's room, the atmosphere was electric with tension. For while Sophie tried to calm herself, her father sat rigid in the corner, his expensive watch ticking like a countdown not just to his daughter's operation but to his own reckoning. Because Luna had made one thing painfully clear. She held all the cards, and the man who once declared a maid's child unworthy now depended entirely on her steady hands. What fascinates me here is the symbolic weight of that scalpel, for in Luna's grip it represented not only the possibility of Sophie's healing, but also the question of how we choose to wield power when it is finally ours. And the temptation of vengeance must have whispered to her, imagine the justice of letting David taste despair, of refusing him the mercy he never showed her mother. But Luna was not built of bitterness. She was built of resilience, and that's where her greatness lay. Because she understood something David never did. True strength isn't found in crushing your enemy. It's found in surpassing them so thoroughly that their cruelty becomes irrelevant. And by choosing to operate, she was not excusing his past. She was reclaiming her own narrative, showing that her purpose would never be defined by his hatred. Sophie, wise beyond her years, sensed this dynamic, and with a voice trembling from both fear and gratitude, she asked Luna, "Why are you doing this? After everything my father did to you and your mother?" And Luna, steady as ever, answered, "Because, Sophie, you are not responsible for your father's sins, and I became a doctor to heal, not to hate." And that statement is profound, because it cuts to the heart of ethical power, how we use our abilities when our enemies are at our mercy, and whether we choose justice that uplifts or vengeance that destroys. Meanwhile, David tried to protest, insisting that Luna was manipulating the situation with her documents and her threats. But every word he uttered only deepened Sophie's disgust, because she saw what he refused to admit, that his empire had been built not on merit but on the broken backs of people like Carmen Rodriguez. And in that realization, Sophie began to sever the invisible chain of loyalty that had bound her to her father, deciding silently that she would no longer carry his name or his shame. And here lies another layer of this story. While Luna prepared to heal Sophie physically, she was also healing her spiritually, giving her the clarity to reject an inheritance of arrogance and to choose a legacy of compassion. Think of the imagery. Luna reviewing charts under the soft glow of her office lamp, her stethoscope hanging like a badge of hard-won honor. David pacing like a caged man whose power is slipping through his fingers. Sophie lying awake, torn between fear of paralysis and the hope that the girl she once laughed with in the garden could now restore her freedom. 3 lives intertwined by one decision, one scalpel, one dawn that would either end in despair or in rebirth. But beyond the human drama, what makes this moment powerful is what it reveals about society. How easily the privileged dismiss the poor as disposable until the tables turn. How often dignity is denied until those denied rise so high they can no longer be ignored, and how justice sometimes arrives not in courtrooms or protests, but in the quiet determination of someone who refuses to be broken. And Luna embodied that truth. As the hospital clock struck midnight, she closed her folders, whispered a silent prayer to her mother's memory, and prepared for the morning ahead, knowing that with every cut, every stitch, every careful movement of her hands, she would not only save Sophie, but also etch a permanent lesson into David's conscience, a lesson he could neither buy nor erase, that the people you step on climbing the ladder may one day hold the ladder steady when you are about to fall, and their mercy, not your money, will decide your fate. Morning came like a drumbeat, crisp and unrelenting, and as the sun bled through the hospital blinds, Sophie Morrison was wheeled into the operating theater, her eyes searching for Luna, not as a doctor now, but as a lifeline, while her father sat outside, his confidence stripped to a fragile shell, for the empire of wealth he had built over decades could not cross the sterile threshold of that surgical room. And in this lies a truth that humbles even the proudest. The operating table is the great equalizer. No gold watch or corporate title has power here, only skill, knowledge, and the quiet strength of the surgeon's hands. Luna stood at the head of the table, gloved, masked, eyes steady, the weight of 2 decades of memory humming in her veins. And yet she felt no hatred, only focus, because this was her arena, her proof, the place where her purpose eclipsed the shadows of humiliation. And though she remembered the garden, the tears, her mother's suffering, she let none of that guide her scalpel. For vengeance had no place in her craft, only precision, only mercy. And this is what separates those who rise from those who sink, the ability to carry wounds without letting them poison your work. David sat in the waiting room clutching his head, replaying every cruel word he had ever spoken, and for the first time in his life he prayed not for profit or prestige but for grace. Though the irony burned, he was now begging the same child he had banished to spare him a pain worse than death, the loss of his daughter. And perhaps this is what justice looks like, not fire and brimstone, but being forced to live with the unbearable knowledge that the person you once deemed beneath you now decides the fate of the one you love most. Inside the theater, Luna's voice was calm, instructing her team, marking each stage of the delicate procedure, her hands moving like choreography honed by years of study and sacrifice, and every cut seemed to slice deeper into David's arrogance, even though he could not see it, because the girl he tried to silence was now orchestrating miracles, wielding science as both weapon and shield, proving that dignity denied in childhood can bloom into destiny if fueled by resilience. What fascinates me is how the surgery itself becomes metaphor, the removal of degenerative blocks, the reconnection of fragile pathways, the restoration of motion to what was paralyzed, mirroring the way Luna's life had rebuilt itself from the paralysis of humiliation into the movement of triumph, and in that room every stitch carried symbolic weight. This was not just Sophie's body being repaired. It was an entire narrative being rewritten. Hours passed like lifetimes, tension hovering, until at last the final suture was placed, monitor steady, and Luna, removing her gloves, whispered to herself not words of revenge but words of release, because she had proven to herself, to her mother's memory, to the world, that cruelty had not broken her, and now her compassion had the final word. When Sophie awoke, groggy but alive, Luna leaned close and said softly, "The hardest part is over. Now you learn to walk again." And Sophie, with tears welling, managed to whisper, "Thank you, not just for the surgery, but for the grace of separating her from her father's sins." And that gratitude was genuine, deep, the kind that plants seeds of transformation in a life. Outside, David rose as Luna approached, and in that corridor silence pressed heavy as stone, because he expected fury, expected condemnation. But what he received was worse calm dignity, Luna simply stating, "Your daughter will walk again," and walking past him without waiting for thanks, leaving him crumpled in the weight of his own smallness. Because true punishment for the arrogant is not rage, it's being ignored. It's realizing you are no longer relevant in the narrative of the person you once tried to erase. Here's the lesson buried in this moment. Vengeance satisfies for a heartbeat, but transcendence echoes forever, and Luna chose transcendence, reminding us that the best revenge is not to destroy your enemy, but to become untouchable in your greatness, to heal when you could have harmed, to walk past when you could have struck, to leave them haunted not by your fury, but by their own reflection in the mirror of your mercy. The surgery was a success, but success in medicine is never the end of the story. It is the beginning of a long, uncertain climb, and as Sophie awoke to the first faint sensations in her legs, tears welled not because she was instantly cured, but because hope had returned, hope that she might walk freely again, that her body no longer belonged to paralysis but to possibility. And when she looked at Luna, it wasn't the gaze of a patient to a doctor, but of a friend to the girl who once spun in circles to make her laugh, now returned with hands that rewove her future. And in that fragile smile you could see something shift, a bridge being rebuilt across 20 years of separation, a bridge David had once burned in arrogance. David, however, stood in the corner of the hospital room like a man watching his own empire collapse brick by brick, because while Sophie's strength was returning, his power was unraveling. For Luna had not only saved his daughter, but also unleashed a tide of truth he could not contain. The folder of documents sat heavy on the bedside table like a verdict waiting to be read, every page a mirror reflecting decades of exploitation. And though he tried to dismiss it as irrelevant, Sophie picked it up with trembling hands, reading aloud lines about underpaid workers, blacklists, ruined families, and the silence in the room grew unbearable, broken only by Sophie's whisper, "Dad, how could you?" A whisper that cut deeper than any accusation, because it wasn't just condemnation, it was disappointment. The one thing David had never prepared for, and in that moment he looked smaller than ever, not the towering millionaire, but an old man cornered by his own sins. Luna didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply let the document speak. And this is where her brilliance shines again. Revenge is loud, justice is quiet. It doesn't need theatrics, it just needs truth, and truth has a weight money cannot silence. Sophie, still weak from the operation, turned to her father and said with a steadiness that surprised even her, "I will never inherit your cruelty. I will not carry your name into the future. One choose a different legacy." And with those words, the generational chain broke. The arrogance passed down from father to child was severed, replaced by compassion inspired by Luna's example. And if you think about it, that is the deepest form of justice, not just punishing the guilty, but ensuring the innocent are free to walk a different path. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, Luna's lawyer friend prepared filings for the Department of Labor and the IRS, meaning David's reckoning was no longer just personal but legal, systemic, the kind of justice he could not buy his way out of. And when confronted with the news that investigations were already underway, his shoulders sagged as though the weight of decades had finally caught up with him. Because they had, and this too matters, because it shows that cruelty in business is never just numbers on a page. It leaves scars on real families. And when those scars are finally recognized, the truth cannot be buried forever. But let's pause to analyze Sophie's transformation, because it is easy to see Luna as the hero and David as the villain. But Sophie's role is more subtle and arguably just as important. She represents the possibility of redemption not for David, but for the future. She is the proof that cycles of arrogance can be broken, that the children of cruelty need not become cruel themselves. And her gratitude to Luna was not just for her life, but for the clarity of realizing she could build something different, something just. David, by contrast, was left with nothing but silence, stripped of wealth, stripped of authority, stripped even of his daughter's trust. And perhaps that is the greatest punishment of all, to live long enough to see the empire you built revealed, not as greatness, but as exploitation, and to watch your child reject your inheritance in favor of the values of the very people you once trampled. Luna, calm as ever, prepared to leave Sophie in the care of the nurses, turning to David one last time to say, "Your daughter will heal, but you, Mr. Morrison, will now face the consequences of everything you've done." And she didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one, because her life, her career, her compassion had already spoken louder than any argument ever could. And David sat back, a man reduced to silence by the very child he once tried to erase. In the days that followed the surgery, Sophie's recovery was slow, painful, filled with tremors of frustration and flashes of hope, yet every small twitch in her legs, every hesitant step with assistance, was a miracle she savored like sunrise. After a long night, and through it all, Luna stood firm as both surgeon and silent witness, reminding her that healing was not just physical but symbolic, that each muscle reawakened was a rebellion against the paralysis her father had unknowingly imposed for years with his arrogance, because David's cruelty had tried to cage joy in the garden decades earlier. But now Sophie's restored movement became living proof that joy cannot be permanently silenced. It simply waits for the right hands to release it. David, meanwhile, wandered the hospital like a ghost, his expensive suit now a costume that fooled no one, staff whispering about the documents Luna's lawyer had uncovered, about decades of complaints, tax evasion, unpaid wages, and for the first time in his life, David felt not admiration nor fear from those around him, but pity, and pity is a poison the arrogant cannot swallow. because it strips away the illusion of dominance and replaces it with the one thing they dread most: irrelevance. Sophie noticed this too, the way nurses treated her father with polite indifference but showered Luna with genuine respect, and she began to see the contrast more clearly than ever, that power built on cruelty demands respect but never earns it, while power built on compassion is given it freely. And in that realization she found the courage to confront her father head-on. One afternoon, while practicing her first assisted steps with Luna's team, Sophie turned to David and said with a trembling but resolute voice, "I don't want your money. I don't want your name. I want a life built on values you never lived by." And her words were not shouted, they were whispered. But whispers often carry further than screams, and David's face crumpled because he understood in that instant that he had lost not just his empire but his daughter's loyalty. And no bankruptcy or prison sentence could hurt as deeply as that. Luna, hearing this, did not intervene. She let Sophie's voice cut the chain, because she knew true healing is not just medical, it is generational. It is the courage to choose a different path than the one paved by cruelty. And Sophie was choosing compassion, justice, dignity, the very things her father had denied others. Here's the brilliance of this shift. Luna's greatest victory wasn't simply saving Sophie's legs, it was inspiring Sophie's heart, planting in her the determination to turn her survival into advocacy, to use her second chance not as a private gift, but as a public mission. And soon Sophie began writing articles from her hospital bed, exposing the exploitation hidden in plain sight in households like her own, telling stories of domestic workers silenced, underpaid, discarded. And her words carried a weight her father's money never could, because they were born from truth, from lived experience, from the transformation she herself had witnessed in Luna. David tried desperately to silence her, warning that she was destroying their family's reputation. But reputation built on exploitation deserves destruction, and Sophie knew this, so she pressed harder. Her journalism sparking outrage, inspiring discussions about workers' rights, echoing Luna's own quiet rebellion into the larger world. And what fascinates me is how quickly the roles inverted David. Once the commanding millionaire, now begged his daughter to protect him, while Sophie, once paralyzed and silenced, now stood taller with every word she wrote, empowered not by his wealth but by Luna's example, and Luna herself remained the anchor, reminding them both that true greatness is not inherited but earned, that dignity cannot be bought, only lived. The recovery room became a symbolic courtroom, Sophie delivering verdicts of rejection against her father's legacy, Luna presiding as the silent judge who had already proven her case through action, and David the condemned, forced to watch the empire of arrogance he built crumble under the weight of his own daughter's truth. And here lies the deeper message: healing is not just about standing again, it is about standing differently, choosing to walk paths your parents avoided, refusing to replicate cycles of cruelty. And Sophie's first steps after surgery became more than medical, they became rebellion, a declaration that the chains of arrogance end here. While Sophie's steps grew steadier with each passing day, David Morrison's footing in the world disintegrated beneath him, for the investigations Luna had quietly set in motion were now in full swing, and what had once been whispers of exploitation, buried under settlements and silence, erupted into official inquiries, court filings, and headlines he could not control. The Department of Labor tallying 47 separate complaints, the IRS flagging years of tax evasion and unreported wages. And suddenly, The empire David had spent decades building was revealed. Not as genius, but as theft. Not as leadership, but as predation. And the irony was suffocating. The man who once dismissed a maid's child as unworthy was now dismissed by society as a criminal hiding behind a facade of success. Bankruptcy papers followed swiftly. The lavish mansion with its marble garden was repossessed, accounts frozen, lawyers fled as retainers evaporated. And David, once the figure who commanded boardrooms with arrogance, now sat alone in a cramped apartment staring at foreclosure notices and legal summonses. And this is where the story's moral weight lands hardest. Because his downfall wasn't crafted by some rival or accident. It was built into the very bricks of his empire. Every underpaid wage, every fired worker, every blacklisted name stacking silently until it collapsed, and Luna merely lit the match of accountability, watching as the structure consumed itself. Sophie, meanwhile, distanced herself completely, legally changing her name to her mother's, publishing essays about workers' dignity, appearing on talk shows to share her story not of being a millionaire's daughter, but of being saved by the compassion of someone her father tried to erase. And with each interview, David's shadow shrank further, his own daughter dismantling the very illusion he once clung to. And here lies another layer of poetic justice. Not only did his empire fall, but the voice of truth came not just from Luna, but from his own blood, ensuring that his legacy would forever be rewritten by those he failed to silence. Luna, for her part, did not revel in his misery. She was busy operating, teaching, building programs for children of domestic workers to study medicine, proving again that her victory was not in his destruction but in her construction. And yet, she did not shy away from accountability either, making sure Carter, her lawyer ally, filed every piece of evidence, ensuring that justice was not only poetic but legal, because personal redemption cannot replace public accountability. Think about what this collapse represents beyond one man. David symbolizes every corporation, every leader who treats workers as disposable, and his downfall echoes a larger truth. Exploitation is never sustainable, arrogance never eternal. Because eventually, truth finds the cracks, and when it does, no amount of wealth can patch them. The contrast between father and daughter sharpened with every passing week. Sophie gaining strength, running laps eventually around the hospital garden where she once sat in a wheelchair, her laughter echoing again while David was reduced to shuffling through court halls, flanked not by admirers but by guards, his back hunched, his gaze empty. And if there is a punishment worse than prison, it is this: living long enough to see yourself become irrelevant, your empire dismantled, your daughter liberated from your shadow, your legacy forever defined not by what you built, but by what you destroyed. While David Morrison's name was dragged through court filings and headlines, Luna's name began to appear in places of honor, medical journals, award ceremonies, news segments celebrating not just her brilliance as a surgeon but the resilience that carried her from a maid's daughter to a pioneer in pediatric neurosurgery. And the juxtaposition was striking: one life collapsing under the weight of exploitation, the other ascending through the light of compassion and determination. And it wasn't coincidence, it was consequence, because every humiliation David hurled became fuel for Luna's resolve. Every injustice Carmen endured became the blueprint for Luna's purpose, and the world was beginning to recognize it. The first recognition came quietly, a nomination for Physician of the Year, an award that historically went to older doctors with decades of practice. But Luna, under 30, was honored because her revolutionary techniques had restored mobility to dozens of children once condemned to wheelchairs. And when she accepted the award, she did not speak about herself, but about her mother, saying, "Every injustice we face can be transformed into fuel for change if we dare to persist." And in that line lay the essence of her story, not revenge, not resentment, but transformation. Soon after, her life became the subject of a documentary titled From Cleaning to Surgery, produced by none other than Sophie Morrison, who now used her journalism skills not to protect her father's name, but to amplify Luna's, and the film was nominated for an Emmy in the category of Best Social Rights Documentary, proof that narratives of resilience resonate far louder than tales of privilege. Luna also launched the Carmen Rodriguez Medical Scholarship aimed at children of domestic workers who dreamed of entering medicine. And within the first few years, dozens of young doctors began to graduate under her program, each one a living defiance against the cycle of poverty and exploitation that David Morrison and men like him had sustained. And what fascinates me here is how Luna turned personal pain into communal healing, how she refused to let the story end with her own success, but instead multiplied her triumph into opportunities for others. And this is the true definition of legacy, not what you build for yourself, but what you build for generations. Meanwhile, David, now convicted of labor exploitation and tax fraud, was sentenced to prison, his final public appearance one of shame, shuffling in handcuffs, reporters shouting questions about hypocrisy and greed, his once pristine suits replaced with standard-issue grays, and the poetic justice was undeniable. The man who once denied workers minimum wage now earning pennies for prison labor, his wealth gone, his reputation destroyed, his daughter absent from the courtroom by choice. Sophie by then had taken her mother's last name, cutting legal ties from her father, and had established a foundation in her own right, converting the very Morrison mansion, once a monument to exclusion, into a shelter for vulnerable domestic worker families. The marble garden where Luna was once humiliated, now echoing with children's laughter and meals shared freely. And if that is not the pinnacle of poetic irony, what is? The place once built on arrogance, transformed into a refuge of dignity. Luna, standing on that same ground years later, visiting the foundation, reflected aloud that the best revenge is not to destroy your oppressor, but to build something so extraordinary that their cruelty becomes irrelevant. And those words, carried in interviews, resonated far beyond the story itself, becoming a mantra for those who had ever been dismissed, humiliated, or denied. In the end, Luna's rise was not just personal triumph, it was a cultural lesson, proof that education, persistence, and compassion are the most dangerous weapons against arrogance, and that no matter how deeply someone tries to bury you, seeds have a way of becoming forests if watered with determination. Years slipped by, and with them the final layers of David Morrison's illusion peeled away, for prison stripped him not only of freedom but of identity, reducing the millionaire who once believed he could buy the world into just another inmate, with a number stitched across his chest, and perhaps that was the sharpest blade of justice, that the name Morrison, once spoken with reverence in boardrooms, was now muttered with disdain in courtrooms, while the name Rodriguez, once dismissed in whispers as a Maid surname, was now engraved on hospital plaques, scholarship certificates, and awards, shining brighter than David could ever imagine. Sophie, liberated from his shadow, never visited him in prison, not out of cruelty, but because she no longer needed answers. She had found her own path, running each morning on legs Luna had restored, writing articles that exposed systemic exploitation, giving lectures at universities where she told students that true strength is not inherited, it is chosen, and sometimes it is borrowed from the courage of others until you find your own. And with every word, she chipped away at the myth of her father's greatness, replacing it with a narrative of accountability and redemption through truth. Luna, meanwhile, was not content to rest on personal triumph. She inaugurated the Carmen Rodriguez Institute of Social Medicine, a sprawling center dedicated to training young doctors from underserved backgrounds, offering full scholarships, mentorship, and community outreach. And at its opening ceremony, she spoke with serene authority. "My mother once told me that some people are born believing they are better than others, but those with good hearts always find a way to shine today. This institute is proof that she was right." And the audience erupted in applause, not only because of her words, but because of the embodiment of them standing before them. A woman who had carried humiliation not as a chain, but as a torch. David, in his final years behind bars, received a letter from Luna, not cruel, not vengeful, but devastating in its calm, reminding him of that day in the garden when he declared she did not belong, and telling him that he was right in one sense. She did not belong in his world because she had surpassed it. Her place was far above the narrow confines of his arrogance, and in that moment he finally understood that he had not crushed a child, but planted a seed, one that had grown into a tree sheltering generations, a tree whose fruits he would never taste. And that realization, more than iron bars or court sentences, was his true punishment. Luna's story spread far beyond medicine, entering classrooms, boardrooms, grassroots movements as a parable of resilience, a reminder that the best revenge is not to mirror cruelty, but to transcend it, to create a legacy so enduring that the end of the day. Names of those who once humiliated you fade into footnotes while yours becomes a beacon. And here lies the ultimate takeaway, that oppression, arrogance, and cruelty may wound us, but they cannot define us unless we let them. That dignity is not given by the powerful, it is claimed by the persistent, and that justice is not always about punishment, but about building something greater in the ruins of injustice, something so undeniable that even your enemies are forced to acknowledge it. In the end, David Morrison's story became a cautionary tale of arrogance destroyed by its own excess, while Luna Rodriguez's became a legend of resilience, compassion, and transformation, and Sophie's became the bridge between the two, proving that cycles can be broken, that children can choose a different legacy than the one handed to them, and that sometimes the girl once dismissed for dancing in a garden becomes the woman who teaches the world how to stand tall again. So what do we learn from the story of Luna Rodriguez, Sophie, and David Morrison? That humiliation can become motivation, that cruelty can forge resilience, and that true power is not the ability to tear others down, but the capacity to rise so high their cruelty becomes irrelevant. And this is not just their story, it is ours, because each of us carries scars from words or actions meant to diminish us. And the question is what we will do with those scars. Will we let them fester into bitterness, or will we transform them into blueprints for something greater? Luna chose the latter, refusing to let one man's arrogance define her future, instead building a life of healing, creating scholarships, lifting communities, ensuring that children like her would never again be told they did not belong. And in doing so, she showed us that revenge is not in destroying your oppressor, It is in surpassing them so profoundly that their cruelty becomes a footnote to your story. Sophie's choice matters too, because she proves that cycles can be broken, that even if we inherit the shadow of arrogance, we can step into the light of compassion, and her rejection of her father's legacy is as important as Luna's triumph, because it reminds us that generational change is possible. David's fall, tragic yet deserved, stands as a warning to all who build power by stepping on others, that every injustice stacks like bricks in a fragile tower, and eventually truth topples it, leaving nothing but rubble and regret. And so the next time someone tries to tell you that you don't belong, remember Luna's journey. Remember that the dance she was once shamed for became the rhythm of a life that lifted thousands. Remember that your scars can become your tools. And remember that true greatness is not about privilege, but about purpose. Not about what you inherit, but about what you create. And when you choose compassion over cruelty, resilience over bitterness, you don't just rewrite your own story, you rewrite the stories of everyone who comes after you.